Hello everyone, I'm Pastor Michael Shultz and this is the 7th edition of our study through the book of Proverbs. This leaves us in the 7th chapter of the book of Proverbs, and this is almost becoming a redundancy, but what we find in the book of Proverbs in chapter 7 is another admonition of the wise father specifically relating to the subject of sexual fidelity and abstaining from adultery. Now, this is the 10th admonition of the wise father, but this is the third of those 10 that specifically falls on this category. And I think that it's important to realize that the author of this book is clearly admonishing his sons to avoid failing in an aspect that he was not capable of avoiding. We learned in the very first verses of this book that the author of the first several chapters, at least, the majority of the book, is Solomon. And what we know about Solomon through the Bible and through history is that Solomon was a womanizer. And I think that he was, at least in some ways, aware of the fact that his great failure in his life was his relations with women. And so what we find here is another admonition for his sons to avoid this great failure that he has fallen into. So, there's three different sections, if you will, that this chapter falls into, although all three of them are within the single admonition of the wise father. Verses 1 through 5 are simply a request that the sons commit these things to their hearts. Verses 6 through 23 elaborate on a certain story of a man who willingly goes to bed with a woman who he's committing adultery with, so he knows that he's doing this, but he does it anyway. And verses 24 through 27 tell the boys again that there are punishments for these things and that they will not be the first to fall into it, but they will also not be the last. They will not be the first to think that they can get away with it, and they won't. So I want to dig a little bit into this, as this is a chapter that really says a lot of the things that we've already discussed. I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on it. Again, I'm not going to read the entire chapter to maintain the brevity of these videos, but I do want to dig into it here. I want to look first in verse 2. It says, "Keep my commandments and live, and my law as the apple of thine eye." Now, I think that this is interesting because he says, keep the law as the apple of your eye. And that's interesting to me because the Word of God tells us that we are the apple of God's eye. So it would almost make sense that that would be reciprocal. You would imagine that the Bible would tell us that we are the apple of God's eye and that God should be the apple of ours. And by the way, this phrase, to be the apple of the eye, means to be the favorite, to be heavily favored, to be so elevated in somebody's reckoning that you are the supreme in their figuring. You're everything to them. You're number one in all cases. And so in terms of God's creation, the humans, mankind, is the apple of his eye. We're the supreme creation. We are the pinnacle, the paramount of everything that he's created. I'm fighting a sneeze, so excuse me. But he tells us that even he is not to take that slot in our lives. We shouldn't so elevate God to the point that we refuse to follow his law because we think that we are being more true to him. Now this is an interesting clarification. He says, allow my law to be the apple of your eye. And I think that a lot of religiosity, if I can use that phrase, in our culture, in our communities, has fallen on this passage, because what we would rather do is we would like to be true to God as we interpret him, or as we encounter him. And that's almost an exact quote from Alcoholics Anonymous Commitment and Narcotics Anonymous Commitment. They want you to have a relationship with a supreme being or a higher being in whatever way that you experience them. And I'm actually in favor of AA. I'm in favor of NA and AA. But I don't think that that sort of commitment or that sort of interpretation of God or our experience of him should transfer over into the religious realm. I believe that if you're somebody who wants to make a claim that you have a relationship with God, you ought to have a relationship with a person and not with your interpretation or your experience of a being. So let me be clear on that. There are a lot of people who they're not religious in the phrase that This is another thing that we've fallen out of. We say, I love God, but I hate religion. Well, that's like saying, I love my wife, but I hate marriage. You can't denounce the institution by which you relate to something, but also elevate the thing that you relate to. You can't say, I love my wife, but I hate marriage. That doesn't make sense. And in the same way, you can't say, I love God, or I love Jesus, but I hate religion. Religion is the institution by which you relate to God. It is doctrine and theology and ecclesiology and eschatology. And it's all the ways that we study God and that we become more wise in our understanding of God and the ways that we tell other people about God. Soteriology and all of these things. This is how that we know about God. This is how that we get closer to Him and that we become wiser in our understanding and in our experience of Him. So to say you hate religion but you love God is really foolish. You're denouncing the very institution by which you say that you love the thing. So we have a lot of people that promenade about as though they love God. They say they hate religion, so they undermine the institution of the church, but they say that they love God. But really what they love is their idea of God, their interpretation, or even their creation of God. They say, I don't believe in a God that would send people to hell, or I don't believe in a God that would denounce the institution of gay marriage. I don't believe in a God that would tell somebody what to do with their body in the relation to abortion or any other controversial aspect for that matter. I don't believe in a God that would tell me that I couldn't have more than one sexual partner. I don't believe in a God that would tell me this and that and the other. And so they create their own God, which, by the way, their own God is always very foreign to what you find in the Bible. But they claim the foundation of their belief to be based on the Bible. And what they've done is they have elevated this idea or person of God above God's law. And that's what he says here in Proverbs 7:2. He says, my law should be the apple of your eye. It is so supreme that it even goes above your idea of me. Because by knowing my law, you will know me. He is the perfect embodiment. This is what we find in John chapter 1 and verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He's the perfect expression and embodiment of God by being the perfect fulfillment of the law. I've come not to destroy the law or abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. He fulfilled all of the laws, and by that he embodied exactly who God is. The law is not a set of rules that God has set and he abides within them. The law is the perfect expression of how that God exists, who he is, his person. And to follow the law perfectly would be to be God. That's what Jesus did. That's how that we know that he was God. And one way is that he kept the law perfectly. And the law is the perfect expression of who God is. It's his personality. So, this is a far cry from the Islamic form of dictation theory, where God sets laws based on what he wants and he changes the laws as he desires. The Christian idea of the law is that the law is proceeded forth from God because it reflects his own personality. God would never break the law because the law is based on who he is. And so he says, elevate my law, not my person, not who I am, but what I have told you I do and what I believe and what I set as the standard. Elevate that and you will know me. And we find this reiterated through the New Testament in the person of Jesus Christ. John chapter 14 and verse 15. If you love me, keep my commandments. John chapter 8 and verse 31. If you keep my commandments, you are my disciples. He makes it very clear. The people that follow his law and his commandments, they are the people that are following him. And the people that follow him will know him. This is very clear. So all of that coming out of verse 2. What a verse. What a power verse to begin with. Verse 3, he says, bind them on thy fingers, write them on the table of thine heart. Leonard Ravenhill used to use this phrase a lot, this write them on the fleshy table of your heart. And I believe that this is a callback to what we found in chapters 4 and 5, where he's admonishing his son to commit these things to memory. It's crucial that you commit Scripture and you commit wise words to memory. It matters because you're not always going to be able to take a book and show somebody, but you can always recite it to them. You can tell somebody these things. And it also is more important for your own personal commitment to God, your own personal walk. It's important to commit these things to memory. Moving on into the second section, verses 6 through 23. This is a narrative about a man who willingly enters into a relationship where he's committing adultery. And there's some interesting things that I want to dive into here. First, I want to look at verse 11. It says, she is loud and stubborn, speaking of the adulteress. Her feet abide not in her own house. Now that the second portion there, her feet abide not in her own house. This is a cultural and a societal saying that we've lost as of late. So, in the what I'm going to refer to as quote-unquote the biblical times, predominantly the Bronze Age, a woman who went out was referred to as she who goes out, and there was a word for that. It was literally where we get the word streetwalker or women of the night. It's the word for prostitute, but the word prostitute was literally translated as she who goeth out. So if you went out of your house for the purpose of anything other than gathering food or something very essential, you were considered to be a prostitute. And it wasn't just that you were considered to, but that was the only reason that a woman would venture out of her house alone, outside of working. If you were out in public alone without a real purpose to be, then culturally and societally it would have been true that you were out there as a prostitute. There was no other reason to be. And so that's actually what he's cueing in on. She is out of her house, her feet abide not in her house. This is, if we want a good example of this, you can look in Genesis chapter 34. There's a woman named Dinah who's the daughter of Jacob, and she goes out. It says that she goes out of her house, and she ends up having a relationship with some of the Canaanite men. And a lot of people interpret this as rape, but if you actually understand the phraseology of she went out, that was a cultural phrase that would have meant that she prostituted herself. And it actually makes more sense with the rest of the story in Genesis 34 that Dinah prostituted herself, because her brothers end up killing all the Canaanites because they quote-unquote defiled her sister and treated her like a prostitute. Well, she was a prostitute, but they were just mad about that, so they killed the men. All of that hidden in the language there. I want to look on at verse 18. It says, "Come, let us take our fill of love until the morning. Let us solace ourselves together with loves," or other phrases, other translations translate that. Let us take solace in our love. This is a point that I have to make a lot of the time, especially in our culture, in our day and age. The Bible, and I've talked about this already in this series, the Bible makes it clear that our idea and our concept of love is totally wrong. I want to make that clear. The Bible says that our concept of love is totally wrong. The idea that we fall hopelessly and helplessly in love is totally unbiblical, and in fact it's anti-biblical. The Bible tells us that we are supposed to have control over our love. We're supposed to have reins, that we rein in our hearts and we rein in our love. And this woman is trying to seduce this man, and she appeals to love. She says, we'll fill our love until the morning. We'll take solace in our love. This is something that is so wrong in our culture. We think that love is unquestionably good, that all love is good. And we see this on the posters and the signs. Every time that there's a gay pride parade, they'll say, love is love. Well, that's fair, love is love, but the implication is that all love is good, and that's not true. Some love is wrong. For instance, a pedophile loves children. That doesn't make it right. And some people are going to say, how dare you compare pedophilia to homosexuality? Well, biblically, hate to say it, they're both sin. So, pedophilia is love of children. Necrophilia, love of the dead. I mean, there's definitely some love that's wrong. We also find examples of love that are wrong in the Bible, specifically coming out of the book of Proverbs and the man that wrote it, Solomon. In 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 3, it says that Solomon loved the Lord. But later on in that same book, 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 1, it says Solomon loved many strange wives. And if you read the rest of that chapter, it says that those wives led his heart astray from the Lord. So his love for these many strange wives was not a good love. In fact, it actually divided him from the love that he had of the Lord, which we as Christians would say is a good thing, that he loved the Lord. So the love that he had for these wives was a bad thing, and that it divided his love that was good. Love is not always a good thing. Love is meant to be garnered, and love is meant to be controlled. We find that again in Proverbs chapter 5, verses 19 and 20. Let her be as the loving hind in the pleasant road. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. Why wilt thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman, and embrace the bosom of a stranger? He says you're supposed to be satisfied with this love. You don't need to go finding other love. And love is a very different concept in our age, but it's because we've polluted it with the idea that love is something esoteric that we can't control, that we have absolutely no garner on it, no reins on it. That's not the biblical concept of love at all. Love is something that you choose. Verses 19 and 20, I want to read those. For the good man is not at home, he's gone on a long journey. He hath taken a bag of money with him, and he will come home at the day appointed. This is another analogy that you could see leading into the New Testament, where Jesus talks to his disciples as though he's going away into a far country. I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am you may be also. But then he also tells many parables about the wise and the Lord and the wise man that is left to go away into a faraway country, and he leaves the hirelings. We talked about that in our discussion of Proverbs chapter 6. And when he comes back, he punishes those that have been disobedient while he was gone. He also tells his disciples to constantly watch, because you don't know the day in which the Lord returns. This is a great analogy for that, because there are some people that they say, the good man is gone. He's gone. He's in a faraway country. He's left on a long trip, and he won't be back anytime soon. We should enjoy our time now. Don't worry about the future. Not knowing that they're setting themselves up for a trap. And verse 23 even tells us that they're like a bird that's running hastily to a snare, not knowing that it will take its life. There are people that, these enjoy the day, for we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Well, we do know what's going to happen tomorrow. Christ is going to return with judgment in his hand, and a sword goes out of his mouth, and he's going to judge the nations. We know what's going to happen on some tomorrow. We just don't know which one it is. And why would we live in sin today not knowing what would happen tomorrow? So we're constantly seeing this sort of thing iterated in the book of Proverbs. But this, I think, is a great analogy for the kind of living that most people fall under. And as we come into the final section, verses 24 through 27, we see again that he begins to refer to his sons in the plural. So we know that he's speaking to more than one of them now. O ye children, he says in verse 24, attend to the words of my mouth. Let not thine heart decline to her ways. Go not astray in her paths. He's talking about wisdom here. For she hath cast down many wounded. He's not talking about wisdom. He's talking about the adulteress. Let not thine heart decline to her ways. Do not go astray into her paths. For she hath cast down many wounded. Yea, many strong men have been slain by her. Her house is the way to hell, going down to the chambers of death. Now, I love that in verse 26, he says, you're not the first ones to think that you can go down this path. You're not the first ones to have this problem. You're not the first ones to think that you can get away with it. You're not the first ones. A lot of young men, and myself included, we have this idea that what they call it in psychology is uniqueness disorder, where young people have this idea that they're the only ones that have ever gone through this. And this is why a lot of young people commit suicide, because they think that they're going through something that nobody's ever gone through before. And that if anybody had ever gone through this before, they couldn't have gotten through it either. So it's no shame on them for giving up and trying not to get through it themselves. We think that everything that happens to us is unique. But the Father's saying, you're not the first ones to try this. You're not the first ones to go through it or to struggle with this or to think that you can get away with it. It says, many strong men have been slain by her. And I think that this is a great point to make, specifically to young men. The wisest man in the Bible, Solomon, the strongest man in the Bible, Samson, and the godliest man in the Bible, Abraham, all fell to their being unable to retain their holiness and to maintain their relationship with God because of their failure to relate right to women. All three, the wisest, the strongest, and the godliest men in the Bible, fell because of their inability to control themselves in regards to women. They fell because they were too sexually impure. They fell because of infidelity. They fell for one reason or another. But they just couldn't contain themselves when it came to women. And I think that Solomon understood this. At whatever point he was at in his life, when he was writing Proverbs chapters 5, 6, and 7, he knew that he was failing in this, and he wanted his sons to do better than he had. So, this has been a brief run through of Proverbs chapter 7. I hope that you've gained something from this study. If you are enjoying it, leave a comment, share it with your friends, and let me know if you have any critiques or any input on this that I'm not covering, something that you would like me to go into. I'd be glad to do that. Again, I'm Pastor Michael Shultz. I want to thank you for watching, and be blessed.